Hi, J. Charles here. I'd like to begin by saying thank you for listening to this novel. This is the first chapter in what will be several terrifying and thought-provoking episodes about a strange and eerie town in Arkansas, with plenty of secrets and plenty of rain. I hope you enjoy this first entry into the series. Thank you. One. The Old Lady in Apartment 4C. Rain. The cool, clear precipitation that falls from the sky by the millions. Rain was all Rosaline Daltrey knew to be real and tangible at this point in her life. It was the one constant that never ceased to fall during her entire stay in Summer Grove, Arkansas. Her time in the small town approaching 50 years. It didn't make a difference if it was the hottest day of the summer or the coldest winter night. The rain was always coming down in Summer Grove, drenching the streets and flooding the valley that lay north of town, next to the railroad tracks. Often Rosie, that's what Rosaline's husband called her when he was still alive, could hear the distant whistle of the cargo train as it pulled out of the shipping yard, with loaded goods from the town's plant, headed towards God knows where, Rosie often thought, listening to the long, drawn-out sound of the train's air horn, and the drops of water hitting the tin roof above her head. On most days she would sit and stare vacantly out the window that faced the alleyway outside her fourth-story apartment in the middle of town. Today was no exception. The rain was coming down in a steady pace on the other side of the paned glass, as it had always done. Droplets of water were rolling their way down the surface of the window in random, meandering paths, coming together at the wooden base of the frame and falling from there to a trough in the alley below. The precipitation was so abundant in Summer Grove, the town council elected back in the 50s to build an extensive system that carried the rainwater to large underground basins, flowing down long tunnels leading out of town. The streets tended to flood anyway, but not as bad as they would have. The widowed Mrs. Daltrey paid no attention to the rain anymore, however. She hardly noticed anything going on around her, her staring eyes blurred by thoughts of her past, memories of a time before Arkansas, before the tiny apartment, and before the rain. Long summer days and nights in the late 60s spent on a beach in Key West, lying next to her tanned young husband, talking about nothing that at the time seemed like the most important conversation in the whole world. Those nights in Florida came back to her often, as she sat in her chair by the window, contemplating slamming her body head first through the glass and meeting her husband a little earlier than God had intended. If God even bothered to lean in and check up on this soaked little town on the outskirts of nowhere. Rosie never liked Summer Grove, but had never worked up the courage to leave after Robert, her husband, had passed away. As if some force was holding a hand firmly on her shoulder, preventing her from taking steps towards the town's city limits. Her depression had kept her docile, but her crippling grief made her long for a release from this life, and from this town. Her thoughts of leaping to her death had halted abruptly days ago, however, the night of the thunderstorm, the night that ended Rosie's sanity entirely. The thunder cracked across the night sky. Lightning illuminated the window of Rosie's bedroom as she attempted to get the precious few hours of sleep she could manage these days. The wind and the rain were steadily becoming worse, keeping her unwillingly awake. Her two cats she had taken in after Robert died, hiding under the bed, hissing and mewing at every loud boom. Robert didn't like cats, a fact that didn't matter much now, she had thought at the animal shelter a few months prior. She had adopted the little animals to keep her company during the lonely days after Robert's car accident had occurred on the turnpike just outside of town. Rosie was lying on her back under the covers when she heard a slow, weak knocking on the glass of the window. Her eyes bolted open and darted towards the sound. It was pitch black in the room, and she could see nothing but the alluring darkness. A few seconds went by, and she heard the knocking again, a shaky little tapping that started her heart beating faster than it should have in her late years. When the lightning flashed again, what she saw would have turned her hair white if it hadn't already gotten there by age. Her husband, Robert, was floating outside her bedroom window. Her husband, who had died 6 months before in an automobile accident, was staring at Rosaline with his pale, dead eyes. Robert was wearing the suit he was buried in. It had been a closed casket funeral due to the intensity of the collision. His head had been badly caved in from the impact, glass penetrating his brain, killing him instantly. In the mere second of light illuminating her husband's body, she could see his misshaped head. Blood dried a deep, sickly crimson around his scalp and under his nose. His left eye was jutting out of his skull from the force of the impact. "Rosie!" She could barely make out him whispering her name through the heavy rain. "You should have been in the car with me, Rosie. We could have went out together. Together forever, Rosie. You let me die alone." His voice was a garbled mess through the rain, but Rosie heard every terrifying word. The sentences coming out of his mouth were muddled. The same blood dried on his scalp and nose was also pooled in his throat. He coughed out some of it as he began to speak again. "I'm burning in hell, Rosie. This town has sent me straight to hell, and I'm taking you back with me." He cackled at her, and as another bolt of lightning brightened up her room, she was frozen solid to her bed when she saw that he was no longer outside the window, but right beside her, looking down at her with his dead eyes. The smell of earth and rotting flesh filled her nostrils as she tried to move her head away from him, but her mind nor her neck would cooperate. She was trembling with fear as he stood there weakly rocking back and forth. "Christ, he looks like he's going to kill over, but he's already dead," she thought feebly as vomit began to ride up her throat to the back of her mouth. Tears trickled down her cheeks, her mouth letting out a tiny hissing sound, her attempt at screaming. But the screams would never come. Nothing would ever come out of her mouth again. That night was the last time she would ever sense anything. Her being was drained out of her body, followed quickly by her sanity. One more flash of lightning brightened her room, brightening her husband's face. But it was no longer broken and bloody. It was the face of Robert in his 20s. He was young again. She only saw that face, one that she hadn't seen in decades, for only a brief few seconds before her whole vision became blinded by a white light, and then faded to black nothingness. An unknown amount of time later, Rosaline was sitting in her chair she had always sat in, the one by the window. She was still wearing her nightgown, the last piece of clothing she would ever wear again. She sat in a catatonic state, staring with dead eyes out the window, out into nothingness. The rain was slowing down, but didn't stop completely. The rain never stopped completely. The light drops of water were hitting against the tin roof that covered the apartment building. Her room was always the best spot to hear the sleepy, ethereal sound it constantly made, although she could not hear it now. Nor could she hear her cats begging her to feed them. They paced around her chair, rubbing their bodies against her legs, hoping to wake her from her dreamlike state. They gave up after a few hours, laying down on the couch, their final resting place where they would pass away from malnutrition. That didn't matter to Rosie, though. Nothing mattered anymore. She came out of her catatonia for only a brief moment when young James Dalton came running down the alleyway below. He was being chased by Billy Eden and David Landgrad, two older high school kids who were constantly giving James hell. Rosie heard the footsteps splashing through the puddles on the asphalt, fading as the boys went further into the alley. She saw the sun almost poke its bright face through the clouds for the briefest of moments, before settling back into her empty, hollow gaze. One of her cats, who was still alive after days of no sustenance, looked up from the couch and towards Rosie. The cat had been startled by his owner's rustling in her chair. Rosie was starting to convulse and writhe, as if she was having a seizure. Her mouth started drooling a pale yellow foam, and her eyes were glossed over with a frosty white glaze. She smelled like vomit and urine. The cat watched as his owner convulsed in her chair, followed by an odd snapping and cracking sound. Within a matter of minutes, her arms began to meld into the arms of the chair, fusing with the wood grain. Her nightgown melted into the skin of her back, as if her body was scorching hot. She slumped over a little before going completely still. Her heart slowed down, and then stopped. The weak and hungry cat, the last living inhabitant of the apartment, slowly closed his eyes, headed towards the long and unending sleep. Relief from the pain of hunger had finally come.